US 1 Radio News Time is 8:18. Morning Magazine with Bill Becker continues.
And joining us right now, Congressman Carlos Curbelo. Good morning, Mr. Curbelo.
Bill, good morning to you and to Chuck from the Capitol today.
Well, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it very much. Certainly the big news from last week, President Trump's announcement changing the policy on Cuba. You were there for the announcement in Miami. What has been the fallout from that? What's going to happen here?
Well, I think that most people are realizing that this is a fairly modest policy change and no major changes, actually no changes at all to Cuban-American travel. The airlines and the cruise lines will continue traveling to Cuba. The focus is on shifting income to Cuba from the military directly to the Cuban people. So you are going to see a little bit of tightening on the tourism ban. Of course, U.S. law, as it's written today, prohibits tourism to Cuba. You can travel under licenses for cultural, educational, religious, sports trips, but tourism is not allowed under law. The Obama administration had kind of been looking the other way and in some ways encouraging people to violate the law. This policy shift now will focus a little more on making sure those who are traveling to Cuba have the proper documentation. And I think that's generally a good thing. If we want to change the laws of this country, we should. But ignoring the law, I don't think is usually a good idea.
The Cuban government has basically shot back saying we're not going to be forced to change the way we do things just by President Trump. Did that surprise you at all?
It was a fairly measured response for the Cuban government. And the president did, at the end of his remarks, highlight that the embassy remains open and that he is more than willing to engage in a dialogue, but that we really have to make progress on some of the issues that are important to our country. And one of those that you and I have been talking about for years is the fact that dozens of fugitives of American law live in Cuba very comfortably today. That includes people who have defrauded Medicare, billions of dollars in Medicare fraud. Those people are living in Cuba today. A couple of cop killers, including Joanne Chestnut, who the president mentioned by name at the event. She escaped from prison in New Jersey, killed a state patrol officer, and fled to Cuba. Also, the Cuban military pilots who murdered the brothers to the rescue pilots in 1996, in which 3 American citizens and 1 American resident were blown out of the sky by MiGs while they were flying Cessnas. This was, of course, over international waters. So, essentially, Bill, the Cuban dictatorship under the Obama administration got a pretty good deal. They got all the concessions they wanted and really gave very little, if anything, in exchange. What this new administration is saying is we're happy to engage, but it has to be 2 ways. It just can't be a one-way relationship.
Okay, let's talk about a couple other things. We saw the Navy issue a request for interest in rehabbing the Sigsbee housing, 166 units off Key West, something you've been pushing for.
This was very welcome news, and Bill, the government works very slowly, so we've been pushing this for at least over a year, and finally we see some concrete action from the Navy. They have put out a request for information. That means that they're inviting those who could potentially or would be interested in partnering with the Navy to activate these units for meetings, for informal discussions. But this is a critical first step, and it's evidence that the Navy is committed at the very least to making this happen if it is feasible. And that's what they're trying to determine through this RFI process, the feasibility. But without any question, those 166 units would provide a lot of relief to everyone in Key West, not just military personnel, about half of which civilian personnel live off the base. Those people could now move on the base and free up 166 units in the general market, which would be very welcome news because everyone knows how tough it is for people to find housing in Key West. And there's a lot of development, there's a lot of growth, that's positive, but if you don't have people to work in any of those places, it doesn't really help very much. So I'm excited about it. I wish we could move this along a little more quickly, but this is the government, this is the Pentagon, and we will just keep pushing them to see how quickly we can get those 166 units refurbished and to market.
We'll keep an eye on that for sure. Meanwhile, you've got a bill coming up before the full House for a vote on Friday. Tell us about this.
So I'm very excited about this legislation bill, and I really think these are the types of issues that people back home and people all over the country want us focusing on. We have the welfare program in this country is called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And what we're doing through my legislation is shifting $100 million from that contingency fund from direct payments to individuals to wage subsidies. So this does two things. Number one, it encourages those who are benefiting from these social programs to try to find work, and it encourages employers, those seeking to hire, to give priority to people who happen to be on these programs because they're going to be eligible to receive wage subsidies from the government. So if someone wants to hire someone for $15 an hour, if they hire someone who's a TANF recipient, a TANF recipient, perhaps the government will help subsidize that wage with the cost of the employer will only be about $10 an hour. This is going to encourage people to get ahead, to become self-sufficient, to become productive members of society. And really, I believe, Bill, that work dignifies the human condition. A job is everyone's opportunity to contribute to our society, to our country, to our local communities. And this legislation is actually not going to be this new program is not going to be managed out of Washington. Each state is going to have the ability to build their own demonstration project. At the end of the year, we'll see which states were more successful, and obviously the idea would be that the most successful programs get replicated throughout the country and that we truly make progress on moving people from welfare to work. The government must help those who are in need. We must give a hand up to people who lose a job, who are going through tough times. But the best way to help those people is by getting them the opportunity to work and to contribute to society and to better their own personal situations and their family situations. So I'm very excited about it. This should go to the floor on Friday, and I expect a strong bipartisan vote. My colleague Danny Davis, who's a Democrat, is the co-sponsor. And again, I think these are the types of issues that people all over the country want to see Congress.
Okay. Meanwhile, the EPA recently announced some grants to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. That's something that you've been advocating, haven't you?
Yes, we secured that funding through the omnibus bill that we passed recently. And everything we can do to support the sanctuary and really to support the Florida Keys. I tell people the Florida Keys makes up about 15 to 20% of the population of this district, but when we look at the number of federal issues that Florida Keys residents face, from transportation to environmental, military, the federal government really has a large role in helping maintain a good quality of life in the Florida Keys. And obviously, protecting the environment, the National Marine Sanctuary is a big part of that. We've also in recent weeks announced a grant to Key West International Airport for noise mitigation. All of these small grants, and I say small relative to the size of the federal budget, go a long way towards improving quality of life in the Florida Keys and really to making the Florida Keys resilient, which is obviously a major priority and a big necessity. So we will continue not just doing the heavy lifting of trying to pass major legislation, but doing the blocking and tackling of getting this type of support for
Congressman Carlos Curbelo, thanks for joining us. Always appreciate it. We'll talk to you next week.
You all have a good day. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, bye now.